Greetings and thank you for joining us again as we embark upon our second session of Bible Study on Demand. We are so excited about being able to bring you Bible study in this new format that allows you to access it at your convenience. To those of us who are joining from Allen Temple or St. John, we are so excited to have you joining with us again, as well as those who might not be affiliated officially with either of these congregations. We thank you for joining us as well, and we are excited about what God is doing in this season. As you can see, I'm alone today. Reverend Dr. Washington is traveling and will hopefully be back with us on next week. So we ask your prayers for him as he travels, that he might travel safely and arrive home safely as well. But in the meantime, we're going to continue our discussion that we began on last week as we study scandals in the sacred. We have seen from last week that the Bible is full of scandals, that just like the life and the world in which we live, that nobody is perfect, that scandals have the ability and the possibility of impacting all of us, irrespective of how holy we are, how often we come to church, how much we pray or read the Bible, but scandal can hit all of us at any given time. And we see, as we studied on last week, and we looked at the story of Noah, who was chosen by God to rebuild humanity after the great flood, that Noah, who is holy and as chosen as he himself was victim of a scandal. We saw last week that Noah got drunk, and his drunkenness led to nakedness. And in becoming naked, his son, Ham, saw him, told his brothers, and when Noah found out what had happened to him, the Bible says that he cursed Ham, cursed his son, Ham's son, Noah's grandson, Canaan, and that the curse included that Canaan would be slaves, the descendants of Ham and the descendants of Canaan would be slaves to their brethren of Shem and Japheth. We see from that story a lot of things about scandal and a lot of things about God and a lot of things that are relevant to our lives. We talked last week about the importance of being able to love people through scandal. And the fact that while it's easy to become critical of Noah, we must understand what might have led Noah to do what he did. That Noah had been trapped in a boat for 40 days and 40 nights, an indeterminate amount of time. And yet Noah was still trying to be faithful, but the pressures might have led him to what happened. That while it's easy to become critical of Ham and what Ham did, perhaps Ham was just uninformed and uneducated about the proper way of dealing with what he had seen. And that perhaps his brothers could have loved him through this circumstance by teaching him the right thing to do. We see even from Noah's standpoint, who he wakes up and is angry, embarrassed, and curses Ham, that perhaps in that moment, Noah could have loved Ham differently and shown him mercy through this scandal. We also see that in spite of the fact that this happens the way it happens, that not only do we see the importance of loving persons through scandal, we also see the importance of the fact that God graces even in scandal. That even though this happened in this way that was embarrassing and off-putting, that God still uses Noah, God still uses Noah's family as an integral and central part of the Christian narrative. That although it happened and he can't undo what has happened, and while there may be aspects to the story that still raise questions, how did Noah become naked? What happened here? What was going on? What was really so shameful about what Ham did? There may be aspects of the story that still cause us to wonder. We still see that God blesses in spite of the fact. We also see the importance of, in scandalous moments, not allowing the embarrassment or the anger or the ridicule of the moment to cause us to make regrettable decisions. I often wonder if Noah could do it again. I mean, lay aside the fact that this was God's plan, and we can go to the fact that this may have been a part of a bigger divine orchestrated plot. But I wonder if we could, using our spiritual imaginations, ask ourselves if we could have a conversation with Noah. Would he do it differently? I mean, not only would he not get drunk, but would he respond to Ham differently? Would he maybe use a different set of words, or maybe his response might have been a little bit more loving or caring or gentle? Oftentimes we do things in life that we regret simply because we were in the moment, not realizing the secondary and tertiary effects of our actions. We learn a lot from Noah's story. We learn a lot about how to apply those lessons to our story. We learn that scandal, while it is universally applicable to all of us, is something that we can handle with grace and with mercy and with love, and we might be able to be better as a result. So as we close out this time together, I didn't have any questions from our Allen Temple members. And so hopefully you have been blessed by that story. And I recognize that we have left a lot of meat on the bone there. And just for time's sake, we aren't able to unpack every central element that's there. But hopefully it will encourage you to go back, read the story, do some of your own research. And if you do still have questions, as always, please submit those to us. As a side note, I meant to do this earlier during our housekeeping. If you did not watch last week, and if you do have questions, we do realize that you're not able to live interact with us, but we would ask you to please submit those questions to me via our pastor's email address, which is pastor@allentemplecolumbus.org. You can see it on the bottom of your screen. And so, Allen Temple members, please submit your questions or your feedback through that method, and we will be sure to address those at our next session. For those who may be joining from St. John, you may also use your church email address as well to submit your questions and your concerns to the pastor at that method. This week, I want to shift gears a little bit as we turn our attention to another scandal in the Bible, as we look this week at another patriarch in the Christian faith, a story that is perhaps very familiar to many of you, one that many of you have often heard of or seen and know about or have learned about, whether it be in Sunday school or sermons on Sunday morning. Maybe you've heard about it in another Bible study. And that is the scandal that surrounds Abraham. You know it, Father Abraham, the one who had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham. That Abraham. That Abraham who was chosen by God to be the father of many nations, the one who would have many descendants, whose descendants would be numbered like the sands of the ocean. That Abraham was a central part of a scandal. In fact, there is a love triangle, if you will, between Abraham and his wife Sarah and Sarah's servant, her slave, Hagar. Now, we see this story, we read it. It's a long story that spans over a couple of chapters. And so, for time's sake, I'll give you the background on the story, and then we'll read our text for today. One of the things that we see in the story of Abraham is that it begins with a promise that God makes to Abraham in his already old age, that Abraham would be the descendant of many nations. We don't know why God chose Abraham. We don't know what it was. But for whatever reason, God calls Abraham and tells him to leave his homeland, his familiar place, and to travel to a foreign land, and that he would be the possessor of the land of Canaan. Now we see back to the previous story that we discussed with Noah and the son Ham and the grandson Canaan, and how Canaan would end up being a possessor of a land that God would then give to the other inhabitants in the area. We see how this all comes together. But in Abraham's story, and promising that Abraham would be the descendant or the father of many descendants and have a nation that would call him father, that God promises Abraham that he would give birth to a son, and that son would be the seed by which God keeps his promise. And there's an interesting part here, because God makes this promise to Abraham, but Sarah is never consulted. Now, naturally, you would suspect, if you were Sarah, if you were a wife of someone who is being promised that they would bear a child, naturally that child would seemingly come through you. And so Sarah, being the wife of Abraham, waits patiently in anticipation of this promise that would be fulfilled. God makes the promise to Abraham, and he and Sarah, in their already old age, trust that God would be true to his promise. And the Bible records that for 10 years, they wait on the Lord. Now, oftentimes we throw these numbers around and we don't really take time to let it sink in about the time period that has passed. It's easy to read 10 years, but when you're the person doing the waiting, 10 years is a long time. If we're honest, most of us ain't gonna wait 10 minutes, 10 days, 10 months, yet alone 10 years for a promise to come to pass. So before we become critical of Abraham or Sarah for what happens next, understand that they have been patiently waiting in anticipation of God to fulfill his promise for 10 years. For 10 years, for a decade, for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. Year after year, month after month, day after day, week after week, they have waited and waited and waited for the promise to come. Undoubtedly, they had had some times where they wondered, would the promise ever come? Was God toying with them? Had they misunderstood the Lord? Had they maybe put their own promise and God had not actually spoken to them? At some point, doubt must have entered into their minds to make them wonder, was it ever going to happen? And the Bible records that one day, after waiting for 10 years, Sarah decides to take matters into her own hands. Again, before we become critical, let's understand that Sarah has waited for 10 years. From all pretense, all indications, Sarah meant well. She was not trying to create problems. She was not trying to create tension. She was not trying to create a scandal. But yet, when she takes matters into her own hands, we get the beginning of a juicy story. For Hagar, who is Sarah's slave, becomes a part of the family. Sarah was the head of the tribe, if you will. Sarah was Abraham's wife. Sarah was the head honcho. If Abraham was the king, she was the queen. And Sarah and all of the females, according to that social order, answered to Sarah. And Sarah had slaves, and Hagar was one of her slaves. And in trying to help hurry along the promise of God, Sarah suggests to Abraham, maybe you ought to sleep with Hagar. That way that you might be able to produce an heir through her, and the promise of God might come to fruition thusly. Now let me pause right there, because here we learn one of the first lessons about trusting God and about scandals, generally speaking. Because oftentimes scandals come when we try to do God's job for God. God never asked them for help. God never said, I need your help. God never said, do this in order to make my promise come to pass. Rather, God said, I will do it, and it will happen when it happens. But Sarah, in all of her good intentions, decides to help the process along. And as a result, she introduces a third party into her marriage. Now, let me also stop there, because one of the biggest problems in marriages that scandals happen is when we introduce third parties into the marriage aspect, the marital scene. If I had time, I would go into the fact that you ought not ever have a third party in the marital scene, because nothing good will happen from that. But when Sarah suggests to Abraham that he have relations with Hagar and that a child might be born as a result, of course, it happens. However, Sarah's plan backfires, because as soon as Hagar, who was the slave, becomes pregnant, as soon as she conceives, the Bible records that she starts to dishonor, to torment, to look down upon Sarah. And this is a problem on many levels, not only because Sarah is the head honcho. Sarah is the second, if you will, in command, because she is married to Abraham. She is his wife. She, in the social order, the only reason that Hagar is something now is because Sarah made it possible. And because now Hagar has become pregnant with the child of the man in charge, Abraham, she gets the big head and starts to torment Sarah. Sarah goes to Abraham, says, Abraham, the reason that she's doing this is all your fault. Never mind that I told you to do it. This is all your fault, Abraham. And as a result, Abraham, you need to do something about her. And Abraham says, no, this is your slave. This is your servant. Do with her as you please. We see this shifting of responsibility and nobody wanting to take responsibility for their own actions. Sarah says, it's your fault, Abraham. Abraham says, I ain't got nothing to do with it. I just did what you told me to do. You need to deal with her however you want to deal with her. And as a result, we see what becomes the impetus of one of the greatest scandals, the scandalous stories of the Bible. The Bible records in Genesis chapter 21 that when Hagar finally records or gives birth to her son, that 14 years later, Isaac is born. Now, let me stop there and rewind, because after Hagar conceives, after Sarah complains to Abraham about what Hagar is doing to her, after Abraham tells Sarah to deal with Hagar however you want to, the Bible also records in Genesis chapter 16 that Sarah starts to deal harshly with Hagar. We don't know exactly what Sarah does to her. We don't know what she says. We don't know how she deals with her. But whatever it was enough to drive Hagar out of town. She said, I got to leave this place because Sarah is being so hard on me. And while she's there in the wilderness by herself, an angel of the Lord comes to reassure Hagar that God sees you, God knows your son, and God is going to make sure that this child is also a father with many descendants. Now, if I had time, I'd stop there as well, because I think there's another lesson there about how God helps us even in scandal. Even though that this child has been born as a result of disobedience, even though this child is the result of someone taking matters into their own hands, even though this is not what God has orchestrated in his plan, the Bible assures us that even then, God is going to bless us in the midst of our scandals. That God is not relegated to us having to live perfect lives in order to bless our lives. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting that we ought live imperfect, impure lives by any stretch of the imagination. But what I am suggesting is that even when we mess up, even when we make mistakes, even when we do things we should not do and oftentimes know we ought not do, that God blesses in the midst. In fact, as we go through this series, that'll be a theme that you see recurring, that God blesses even in the midst of scandals. And the Bible records that angel tells Hagar to go back to the camp, go back to the place that you have fled. And even though she goes back and is obedient, life doesn't necessarily become easier because the tensions between Sarah and Hagar remain. After some time, 14 years go by, and finally, Sarah conceives. Finally, the promise comes. Finally, after taking matters into her own hands and giving her servant Hagar to Abraham, even after all of that, after banishing Hagar from the camp, and after Hagar coming back, 14 years old, Isaac is now 14 years old, and finally Sarah becomes pregnant with a son. And it's there that I want to look this morning in Genesis chapter 21, verses 1 through 18. And these words are found. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have bore him a son in his old age. The child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar, the Egyptian, who had been born to Abraham, was mocking. And she said to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God said to him, "Do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring." Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down about a bow shot away, for she thought, "I cannot watch the boy die." And as she sat there, she began to sob. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." As we see in the story, that even after finally conceiving a son, this love triangle, this scandal between Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar has not gone away. We see this tension between who's who and this mixed family unit, and how do they decipher what's what. We even see in the text in verse number 11 that the matter distressed Abraham because it dealt with his sons. Isaac is his son. Ishmael is his son. This is really a mixed family unit. And because the mixed family unit is not getting along, it causes him distress. All of this has come about because Abraham and Sarah got impatient. All of this has come apart because Sarah allows a third party into the marital union. All of this has come about because they tried to take matters into their own hands, and jealousy and envy and dishonor have entered into an equation which has created tensions amongst the unit. But yet and still, the beauty of it all is that God, in his kindness and his mercy, says, even though this has gone not according to my plan, I'm going to bless Ishmael. I'm going to bless Isaac, because I'm being true to my promise to you, Abraham. That even in the midst of a scandal, even in the midst of human error, human fallacy, human misconduct, if you will, that God is still God. We can learn so much from this story that I don't have time to unpack today. But what we see here, hopefully, is that even in the scandalous moments of life, God is gracious. Abraham's story helps us to see, number one, the importance of being patient with God and not taking matters into our own hands. Abraham's story helps us to see the importance of trusting God to be true to his promises on God's timeline. We also see that even in the midst, even when we mess up, we can't mess up God's promise, because God will always be true, even when others do us wrong. We see that even though people may not like us, God can bless us despite the fact. Even though Sarah wanted to do Hagar wrong, God saw her and heard her in her distressing moment and came and saw about her and took care of her son. Beloved, there's so much more here to unpack that we just don't have time to get into today. I look forward to coming back on next week as we discuss and delve in together with my brother, Dr. Washington, when we can really wrestle with some more of the issues that are here in this particular scandal. There's a lot of meat on the bone that now we have the background, now we have the foundation, we understand where this situation comes from. And next week, as we come back together for our third session, we'll continue to delve into this as we look at the scandal of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar, understanding that God still blesses, God still moves, and that we must wait on God. Scandal is born when we do things on our own, but scandal is resolved when God gets in the matter. That even though we are holy and trusting, we must continue to trust, lest we yield to some of the most scandalous moments. I thank you for joining us today. I'm looking forward to next week. I know we have only touched on the tip of the iceberg, but I promise that next week we'll go much deeper as we get back to our normal format with Dr. Washington here as well. We thank you so much. As always, please send in your questions. Please send in your feedback. We are looking forward to continuing this study. Please tell others about this as well. Share it on your Facebook page. We welcome others to participate as we seek to grow this community of believers that are seeking to study and understand God much better. As we depart our time now together, as always, I want to just leave you with this one saying: God loves you, and so do I.